Welcome, everyone. We're very excited to have Dr. Suzette Glasner from UCLA here. She's in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences and Vice President of Clinical Affairs at a company called Quit Genius we were just talking about, which is digital addiction specialty clinic. So they do treatments with multiple modalities involving text messaging and very state-of-the-art IT approaches. And a little bit of housekeeping first. There will be CEUs, continuing ed credits at the end of this. There will be a poll at the end of the discussion about the last 5 minutes if you want to get accredited for those. Her work focuses on digital behavioral treatments for addictions and related psychiatric and medical conditions. 3 major theoretical approaches she's published in: cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational enhancement therapy, and mindfulness treatments. Many of these approaches we've used at the Prevention Science Institute, not quite this focused for addictions treatment or this focused in terms of digital applications. So we're very excited to have her. In the past 3 years, she's published in PLOS One, the Public Library of Science, Drug and Alcohol Dependence, Addiction, Journal of Substance Abuse and Treatment. All of these have been effectiveness or efficacy evaluations, which is very impressive. She has an award-winning book called the Addiction Recovery Skills Workbook. And I'll just read a couple snippets: a cutting-edge, comprehensive, and interactive approach to the science of addiction recovery, in terms of reviewers, that is. An excellent translation of modern science into practical skills and development, from explaining the basic brain changes associated with the development of addiction and laying out a systematic path to behavioral change and recovery, said A. Thomas McClellan, board chair of the Treatment Research Institute and former deputy director of the White House Office of National Drug and Control Policy. So with that, that's an MTV shot of the flavor of Dr. Glasner's research. We're very excited to have her, and we're going to turn the floor over to her. And along the way, you can put questions you have in the chat, and then we'll save about 10 minutes at the end for a more informal question and answer approach. So welcome, Dr. Glasner. We're very excited to have you.
Thank you for that very generous welcome and introduction. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Let me get this into slideshow mode. There we go. So yeah, I have a very interesting topic, and that I've been working on for, I have to say, a decade or so, on advancing technology-assisted interventions for addiction and overcoming barriers to access, retention, and adherence that I'm going to try to cover with you all today. I've done quite a few different types of research studies in the technology-assisted intervention space, and it was sort of hard to select among them for this talk, just because I view so many of them as relevant to the theme of parenting and young people. And one I was very tempted to share on was a Facebook intervention that I developed, but that one was for individuals with cannabis use disorders and depression. So I decided I'm just going to stick to what I've done with opioid addiction, since that's a little more relevant to the general content area here. But I have loads to say about many different modalities. This one is going to be focused more on mHealth and text messaging, but please feel free to ping me down the line if you have questions about some of those other modalities, because we have a lot of tools that we can throw at this problem from a technology standpoint. And with COVID-19 and the sort of general shift in mentality and attitudes towards telehealth and technology-enabled interventions, there's a lot of opportunity to really broaden access to the types of interventions that we only used to be able to deliver in specialty clinics face-to-face. As Dave mentioned, I'm also employed by Quit Genius, also known as Digital Therapeutics Inc. And so I have we were talking about this a little bit just before the webinar started. I have a unique perspective of having done research in academia and have ongoing work in academia as well as in private industry. And that has definitely opened up my eyes to a lot of the challenges that are actually parallel and similar in both worlds, but sort of some of the shorter term goals being very different. So I'm happy to talk about that as time allows. And I'll try to make some references to my different experiences in these different spaces, because I think that interests a lot of people. I just want to acknowledge my collaborators. I'm talking about various research projects I've done with many collaborators, without whom I wouldn't know anything about how to design and test a technology-based treatment. I really started this really sort of a new area of my career about a decade ago, and I've had a lot of support along the way, both from my project staff at UCLA and from the various clinics we've partnered with, and of course, generously from NIH, from 3 different institutes, NCCIH, NIDA, and NIAAA. And so what I'd like to try and cover with the time that I have, I think we all know about the burgeoning role of technology in addiction care, but I'll talk about it for a moment. Even though my specialty area is not in family therapy or family treatment, I want to acknowledge sort of my experience through clinical research and as a trained clinician myself, as far as the essential role of family and social support in recovery from addictions. And then I'm going to really focus on 2 studies of technology-assisted treatment for opioid addiction that have been the focus of my work for over many years, and some of the lessons learned along the way that I'm hoping will help this audience to just gain some perspective on some of the research-related challenges, but then also some of the more sort of like real-world going forward types of challenges and solutions that we've been able to find as a group. So I just wanted to start with this slide. This is a review that was published very recently of funding and published work in technology used in the opioid crisis specifically, that really shows marked increases in both NIH funding and published work across various modalities within digital tech from 2013 to 2017. And that's just prior to the launch of what many of you are probably familiar with as the HEAL initiative, which my work is funded by currently to help addiction long-term. And so those different areas include virtual reality, biosensors, e-health and m-health. And m-health is really a very rapidly growing area of innovation. And I think one of the challenges for us as researchers and then on the other side as consumers is knowing like which ones are the best and which ones are effective, because particularly in these last few years, when so many have turned to telemedicine and technology-enabled treatment, there's just been a very dramatic rise in really kind of an explosion of different health type interventions, both for mental health and for addiction, probably more rapidly growing in mental health and a little more difficult to distinguish between the competitors and the different interventions that are available in the mental health space. But addiction is catching up, certainly. So there has been quite a bit of promise in smartphone applications to address really major barriers to accessibility of evidence-based treatments for addiction, and the potential to really enhance treatment retention through greater engagement. So in a paper that Nora Volkow published a couple of years ago, there was sort of like a highlight of that. What are the different scientific strategies that we have as far as areas of focus for combating the opioid epidemic? And so, like, I'm just highlighting 3 of them as overdose prevention and reversal, treatment of opioid use disorders, and treatment of chronic pain. using alternative complementary approaches, non-pharmacological approaches, and maybe newer, more novel pharmacological approaches that do not carry the risk of addiction. So my work has been focused on the treatment piece, treating opioid use disorders. And I wanted to just touch on the role of the family in relation to a couple of these themes. So in my work at Quit Genius, actually, we have an opioid use disorder treatment program that has very recently launched, and we're beginning to study the preliminary outcomes. And we had this one participant come into our study. I'm going to call him David, even though that's not what he's formally called, just for privacy considerations. And he was a young opioid dependent individual. He was using pills that he was buying on the street that, not unlike many, were unbeknownst to him, laced with fentanyl. And that was revealed in his urine drug screen, but he didn't think he was taking fentanyl. He was really excited and on board about initiating treatment with buprenorphine until he consulted with his partner, Lila. And we had come so far with him. We had him seen already by a prescribing provider, and he had already been given the induction instructions. He'd met with a counselor. He was like what I would consider engaged in treatment. And then he spoke with Lila about his plans, and he came back to us and said, she said, that's just like heroin in a pill, and you don't need to be going down that road to overcome your addiction. And there was really, like, that was sort of the end of the road for him for that moment. We wanted to engage Lila in some way, or maybe talk with them sort of in the way that you would in family therapy or family treatment, but that door was kind of shut. We left the door open to him. I hope that David comes back, and we told him we're willing to talk to Lila and educate her a little bit about some of those myths and facts around buprenorphine. But I wanted to share that with you because some of my recent work has been focused on the role of stigma in as sort of a barrier to individuals accessing care that they really need. And that really brought it to life for me, because I, have been studying that theme and designing interventions around it. That was kind of one of my first cases I was supervising clinically that was like so frustrating to see that he ended up disengaging from care that he really desperately needed, and knowing that he has been taking fentanyl-laced pills. You just don't know from one day to the next what his outcome is going to be. So that stigma is very powerful, and we'll get to it a little bit later in my presentation as far as how we've addressed that theme within our interventions and studied it. And then in treatment of chronic pain, as an approach to overcoming the opioid crisis, I just wanted to highlight a case. I call them Jack and Jill, as a couple who came to us also for that same clinical trial. And they were both addicted to opioids. And, this is thankfully a better story in terms of they're both very engaged in treatment. They're struggling to stay off of opioids. They also were taking prescription opioids that they were buying off the street. But Jill had like a sort of like endometriosis condition or something that caused her severe pain that came up, or sort of the onset of that occurred while she was in the trial. And Jack didn't know what to do to help her deal with that pain except to get her opioids. So she slipped or relapsed to opioid use during the trial when Jack bought her some opioids to relieve her from that pain, which, he was just trying to help her and he didn't know what to do. But he did do something that placed her at greater risk of kind of a spiral with continued opioid use. And our desire was to talk to them together, but she was really worried about him feeling criticized if we were to approach him and talk to him about having given her those pills, and she didn't want him to know that that her treatment team knew that he had provided the pills. It's just an interesting example of how sometimes educating a family, because we have ways that we could educate Jack without making him feel guilty, without making him feel like he messed up her recovery or anything like that. But we have ways that we could educate Jack and talk to him about the priming effect of taking an opioid and how it might set someone into a relapse, and what are some of the alternatives, and what are some of the other ways that she can manage pain, and how should they work together as a couple when one or the other has a desire to use opioids, whether it's for pain or anything else. So I just wanted to bring up these couple of examples, and these kinds of things happen all the time, right? Of the essential component of treatment as involving the family, educating the family, and really sort of approaching this as a unit rather than one individual at a time. They've also very kindly mentioned my my workbook that I published several years ago, actually, and I use in my own private practice, is widely used in practice, is also part of our approach at Quit Genius. And the way that well, first of all, the reason that I wrote this book was because I had been doing science around addiction treatment, validating and studying evidence-based strategies for addiction care for many, many years. And I felt like I was constantly presenting the outcomes and the sort of essential skills to other professionals in the community, scientists and clinicians in training, but that it wasn't really getting into the hands of everyday people who struggle with this condition or have a loved one who struggle with this condition. So I wrote the Addiction Recovery Skills Workbook as like a patient-facing book that summarizes in lay language the essential core skills of the most efficacious treatments that I have studied, CBT, mindfulness-based relapse prevention, and motivational interviewing techniques. So I wanted to just highlight the way that I break that out into the book is I divide it into 7 different steps that are sort of like the sequential steps towards addiction recovery. So the first one being to sort of like strengthen your motivation and commitment to change, and that involves MI exercises. And then the second chapter is called Set Yourself Up for Success. And I just wanted to highlight the role of the family again in setting oneself up for success. So the first step towards setting yourself up for success is getting rid of paraphernalia, so you don't have triggers and temptations around, becoming aware of seemingly irrelevant decisions that you make in everyday life that you might be setting yourself up to be vulnerable to slip or relapse. But when you're not used to thinking in recovery terms about every little micro decision you make in your life, that might not be so apparent. And then third is understand and change as needed your social support network. And again, the family is really key to that step. And then relatedly, setting limits and using assertive communication to sort of really convey what you're going to need in the course of your recovery and involve your family to the extent possible. Because in my clinical experience and in my research experience, I've definitely seen a lot of hesitation to ask for what one needs from their family or loved ones because they feel that they're burdening them. So the idea, like, I don't want to ask so-and-so not to have pills around, or I don't want to ask my husband to get the alcohol out of the house because it might tempt me to drink, which might move me on to other things, because that's really burdening him. So I've really encouraged my patients to think about that. Take a step back and think about how burdensome their addiction might have been on their loved one and family member versus them making some adjustment to help you overcome your addiction. And sometimes it's just a matter of like sort of thinking it through and sort of helping remove that heavy weight of, I'm really creating chaos in someone's life or burden in someone's life by asking them to make accommodations to help me be successful. It's just a little bit of a reframing of that. So some of the ways that I do this clinically is sort of broken out into steps. The first step is taking stock of their current social network. So what are their safety nets versus risky relationships? And really trying to help them figure out who supports their recovery and increase their time with that person, making new friends who are in recovery, or leaning on existing friends and family who are the most helpful. And then finally figuring out who triggers you, plan how to cope. And this is more complicated than it sounds, because often it's the person who they live with or who they're closest to, who they can't actually stop spending time with because they're married to them, or because maybe it's one of their children who is like, difficult, or, so how do you navigate those important relationships to avoid becoming triggered by them? And this is a really significant and important component of treatment for really any addiction, not just opioids. And since the remainder of my presentation is going to really focus on enhancing treatment retention and outcomes, I just want to spend a moment talking about what are some of the discoveries that we've made in science over the past few decades around how you optimize retention. So we know that continuously targeting motivation for recovery is really important. Teaching skills to help avoid relapse using our most well-validated strategies, which are essentially CBT and relapse prevention. Employing methods like contingency management to encourage treatment participation and reward progress is a really powerful intervention, as many of you I'm sure are aware. And as we spent the last few minutes on involving the family in treatment, making mental health care available, and encouraging participation in recovery support programs. One thing that I've learned over the last few years is that there are a lot more recovery support programs than I ever knew about before. It just feels like I learn about a new one all the time. It's not just 12-step. Some people love 12-step. I'm a big proponent of 12-step and the support that it offers, but I also recognize that it's not for everyone. Some people feel like they can't relate to certain concepts in the 12-step program. Some people struggle with the spiritual concepts and feel like they have to, connect with that in order to benefit. I've challenged that idea. I think you just kind of like, if there's anything helpful about it, you go and you draw on that. But really sort of digging into and encouraging alternatives, especially now that there are so many virtual groups and programs that are available. And then encouraging alternative, well, we used to think of these as alternative therapeutic approaches, but they're all almost not alternative so much these days. Meditation, especially via mindfulness, exercise has a lot of data behind it for stimulant use disorders, but also some for opioid and yoga as well. And then also this helps people to sort of reestablish sources of pleasure, which is a real issue as their pleasure system is essentially recovering biochemically in the course of opioid addiction treatment. So I'm sure you've all bought into the value of technology for addiction, or you probably wouldn't have attended this webinar, but I'll just sort of highlight a few, of the most potentially beneficial aspects of using technology to treat addiction. First, to broaden the reach of evidence-based treatments. Secondly, and relatedly, expanding access outside of formal care settings, really sort of the privacy and the convenience factors of being able to receive care virtually can go a really long way towards reaching a more diverse population of individuals who are struggling with opioid addiction. And then the notion of improved fidelity, if you're delivering something like CBT over a virtual platform, particularly if you have it in sort of content that a person can sort of work their way through independently, you know that everyone's getting CBT as you intended it, whereas that's not necessarily the case out in the real world, where there is significant turnover in the addiction workforce. And so sometimes training and fidelity is really hard to keep chasing and keeping up with in a bricks and mortar type of setting. And then some of the other reasons, obviously cost effectiveness, but also enhancing the learning and practice of therapeutic skills, because people can practice those skills and engage with an app or the exercises that it offers at any time, and they can come back to it over and over again. Though I'm not talking about the Facebook intervention today that I developed. That's another means of practicing therapeutic skills in between sessions, because with that intervention, we actually had a session that we called the doctor is in. So like once a week, apart from the weekly therapy sessions that they were receiving, they could sort of check in, in the social media context about, okay, well, I tried, like a mindfulness exercise and it really didn't work for me. Maybe I wasn't doing it right. Maybe I need to try something else. So they're getting this opportunity for between session practice that we believe is really important for the success of approaches like CBT. And then really just enhancing motivation, as you'll see when I present on our text messaging intervention findings. I thought maybe the most impressive aspect of our intervention was going to be the way that we delivered CBT skills, but what the participants really attached themselves to was the motivational and inspiring messages. They really felt that affected their success in recovery. So that could be a real motivation enhancing kind of strategy. And then, like, this is sort of the obvious, stating the obvious, but I think it should be stated that we have this like severe access problem, which is that most people who need treatment for substance use disorders don't receive any. And just as one example from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, in 2019, over 21 million people needed treatment. But I think it's around like a little over 10%, 13% actually received any. And there are various reasons for this. It's not all an access problem, but that is a significant driver. And we can really overcome that using technology. So that sort of leads me to the question of, can technology help solve our dissemination problem? And I mentioned some of this on the prior slide. Evidence-based behavioral treatments for addictions are really underutilized. I wrote a review paper many years ago. I need to update that, I'm sure, but sort of going through all of the different reasons for that. And many of them are those that I mentioned: the high turnover, the cost of training and implementation. So we can overcome a lot of that through technology. So now I'm going to shift a little bit to talking about the specific studies and the ways in which I implemented technology to try and learn about how to impact engagement and adherence to treatments, not only for opioid addiction specifically, but also for infectious diseases. And where this sort of came about was I became kind of interested in how you could use CBT in some way other than that which has been studied for decades, and many replication studies across different substances of abuse, from opioids to alcohol, stimulants. We know CBT is really effective in reducing substance use. But I was kind of curious about, well, like, what else could you do with CBT? Could you use it for other problematic behaviors that would be really impactful in terms of improving one's health overall and well-being? And that's how I sort of came to infectious diseases, because individuals, particularly those who inject drugs, are at heightened risk for infectious diseases, as many of you, I'm sure, are aware. And adherence to treatments for those infectious diseases is highly problematic and really interferes with recovery from addiction. So among the most promising interventions to reduce substance use and HIV risk behaviors and HIV transmission are those that reduce substance use and reduce those injection behaviors, lower the risk of sexual transmission, and then provide antiretroviral treatment for those who have HIV. But as I noted, poor adherence to antiretroviral therapy is problematic among individuals with opioid addiction. I actually did two separate studies, one on those with opioid addiction and HIV, and another with an alcohol-dependent population. I'm going to highlight the study on opioid addiction, but actually we had very similar findings across both. And as many of you probably know, adherence to antiretrovirals is really critical. because this is one of the medications that if you dose it suboptimally, that can actually lead to medication resistance and various negative consequences. And in fact, when we did our trial, our pilot trial of our intervention to promote adherence to antiretrovirals, we did have a few people come into the study and say, this is like my last chance because I'm resistant to every other medication now because I didn't take it properly. So if I can't figure out how to take this medicine and do it consistently, I'm really going to be out of treatment options. So it's a very serious and impactful problem. And there's actually not that many. I mean, there have been more over the years since I started in this area, definitely many more than there used to be. But targeted interventions for people who are living with HIV and substance use disorders, it's really a more recent area of development. So I came to find that there was actually a CBT intervention that was all developed already. All I had to do was figure out how to transport it to technology or to text messaging. And it's known as Life Steps. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's the CBT-based medication adherence counseling approach. And it basically involves 8 steps to improving medication adherence. And so there are these various areas where people struggle to take their HIV meds. So it's making it to appointments, or maintaining their medication supplies, or responding to negative thoughts about missed doses. So and this happens in addiction treatment as well, with the abstinence violation effect. If somebody has one drink and then they go, oh, I blew my recovery, I might as well just keep drinking all day. And that can set them into a relapse that is really hard to come back from. That same kind of effect from a psychological perspective occurs with medication taking behavior. So someone will miss one dose and they'll go, I blew it, I give up for today. But actually, it would have been very impactful for their health and well-being if they had taken it, even though they had messed up. And so in the first study I'll talk about, what we did was we developed and refined a 12-week text messaging intervention that incorporated that Life Step CBT for medication adherence, as well as CBT for relapse prevention for adults with opioid addiction and HIV. And then we tested it in a pilot randomized trial. And I ran the focus groups myself for this intervention. I was so curious about what did people want. What did they want to learn about through text messages? What were they willing to receive text messages about that would not violate their privacy? And what would be the most helpful to them? So we did a focus group with individuals who had HIV and opioid addiction. And here are some of the interesting kind of themes that emerged. First of all, I'll say that I will never develop an intervention without extensive input for the user from the using population. The population, I mean, that will be using the intervention, because they were my best teachers, I would say, in this process. And first of all, I thought that they were going to want text messaging to help them prevent relapse, mostly. The medication adherence was sort of like, I thought that was going to be a little bit more of a secondary aspect, but they expressed a lot of enthusiasm about the medication component, a little bit less so about the relapse component. They were already in treatment, so they kind of felt like, okay, well, we're in treatment, outpatient treatment. We're getting a lot of CBT for that, but we really need your help with medication adherence. And that actually focused a lot of the content of the intervention. They also really liked the idea of it being tailored to them. They wanted to be able to make choices about how many messages per day based on their preferences. They also, and this has emerged across all of my studies and was a bit of a surprise to me, had a very strong interest in research-based information. And I wasn't really expecting that. That they kept saying things like, I'm not going to read all these messages unless you put in front of it, research says, studies say, science tells us, because then I'm going to feel like I have an advantage. Like, this is UCLA giving me science-based information about what I need to do to be successful in recovery, versus this is just some random text message giving me some advice. So we incorporated that. They also were concerned about having some involvement of a clinician or access to a resource that would enable them to reach out if they needed help beyond these automated messages, because they understood that they were going to be automated. They didn't mind that, but they wanted to be able to access a person if they needed to. They also wanted a lot of personalization. They made a lot of suggestions about smiley faces and using their first name and like making it feel like they were talking to someone or someone was talking to them, even if they knew that that wasn't true. They felt they would be more engaged if they had those features. And then they did not want reminders of like, take your, I'll just say buprenorphine, right? Take your buprenorphine. They did not want a reminder specific to a medication. They just wanted it to say, take your meds, so that if anyone happened to see their phone, they didn't know what meds they were referring to. So I'll tell you a few of the features of what we call text CBT. It's a 12-week intervention. And the way that we incorporated the interest in a clinician was we started it with a single CBT session that was face-to-face. And that's where we really got a lot of the information to tailor the intervention to the individual. So what we did there, instead of throwing all 8 of the life steps I mentioned at everybody, we asked them what were the top 3 barriers to medication adherence for them. And we had messaging that was devoted to each of those 3, that we would focus on one of them each of the first 3 weeks of the intervention. And then from weeks 4 to 12, the CBT was really focused on opioid and stimulant relapse prevention. We ended up extending this trial to address both opioid and stimulant use. So we were seeing a mix of the 2, as we still are now. And we also provided medication reminders daily throughout the trial. In terms of the way that we personalized it, the participants chose when they would get medication reminders. They also chose how many texts they would get apart for the medication reminders. For the life steps, barriers to medication adherence, the text incorporated plans that we would make in the sessions to address each barrier during the face-to-face session. So if their problem was that they would have negative thoughts about their medications if they missed one, we would make a plan with them, and we would remind them of that plan, of how they were going to think about it differently. And then we also incorporated personal reasons that taking medications are important to them, and we incorporated those into the text. And then we also incorporated personal reasons that they were entering recovery. So in terms of the features of the content, every 3rd or 4th message asks for a yes or no or a multiple choice question, because to keep them engaged, just throwing them information point after point, we knew was going to be a little bit too much. And that seemed to work pretty well. They could also enter certain keywords to get more information about a particular message. So we wouldn't bombard them with information about meetings. We would prompt them that if they wanted to know about meetings, they could text the word meeting, and then we would send them links so that, again, they wouldn't start ignoring our messages. There were ways that they could reach out. They could text stop to de-enroll. They could text call if they were having a hard time implementing a particular CBT plan, and then a counselor would call them. They had 3 times they could use the function that we call Lifeline to talk with a counselor. We set it at 3 so that if they were needing it more frequently than that, then we knew they might need a higher level of care. And then finally, we had the feature called Crave for a suggestion to get through a real-time craving. And I'll say that that was the function that people used the most. So these are just a few sample messages so you can get a sense of what this intervention looked like for medication adherence. Hi, Suzette, did you take your meds today? If I said yes, I would get an immediate response that said, great job. If I said no, I'd get, okay, we'll try again tomorrow. And then the next message you see here is an example of a plan that they made with the life steps that would be personalized to them, and say, like, your next appointment is on Tuesday. When we met, you mentioned that getting there on time, transportation is sometimes a problem for you. Did you make arrangements for transportation? If they said yes, they get a reply that says, great, we'll send you a reminder the day before your appointment. If they said no, we would revisit the plan we made, and they would be prompted to text call out to us if they had trouble implementing that skill. These are some sample messages in the relapse prevention area. Hi, Suzette, what's the #1 reason for you not drinking today? Oh, this is from our alcohol study. And my response, whatever I responded, I would get a thanks for sharing, stay motivated. And these are just a few examples of how we approach that. So this was a pilot randomized trial. We randomized 50 individuals into the text CBT or the control. And In terms of engagement with the intervention, just to give you a sense of like the proportion of text that people actually responded to, we got the most responses to yes, no questions. The more we asked of them, the less they responded, but we still got decent response rates to the others, over half of the open-ended questions and close to half of the multiple choice. That should actually say the 25 people that were randomized to text CBT, but one of them didn't complete the intervention. So we got really excellent engagement. So here are some of the outcomes I just wanted to share with you. Relative to the control condition, those in the texting condition significantly reduced their opioid use. And these are the percentages over time these are the percentages over time of those who had opioid positive urines. And then in terms of our stimulant use outcomes, we also saw much greater reductions in stimulant use among those in the text CBT condition relative to those in the control condition. And this corresponded well with self-report. And then in terms of changes in antiretroviral therapy adherence, we also showed a significant increase over time from week 0 to 12 in their adherence to antiretrovirals relative to the controls. And though I'm not showing it here, we validated that with CD4 and viral load measurements, and they corresponded with significant changes in both. And now here's a little bit of what participants are saying when they're asked about our CBT intervention, as far as what are some of the particular messages that really stick out that motivated you to change. The ones that asked how I'm doing, and as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the validating and motivational messages like keep up the good work, the motivational ones, and the ones with the research findings like scientific studies that show how people who stay clean will stay clean. And that was the idea that the longer you stay clean and sober, the more likely you are to show longer term success. And then how are you doing with taking your HIV medication since you started the program? There are a couple of quotes there saying, I take them every day. The alarm is helping remind me. Texting makes me think about why I'm taking them rather than just taking them. So I'm going to spend the last few minutes talking about how we transition this text messaging intervention to the app intervention that we're studying now through our funding with the HEAL initiative. So one of the biggest pieces of feedback we got was that it wasn't long enough. 12 weeks wasn't long enough. So we extended the intervention to 24 weeks, and we changed it to address buprenorphine engagement and adherence, because we know that there's around a 50% dropout rate from medication for opioid use disorder treatment. We have these highly effective treatments, but people don't stay in them for long enough to really benefit in the longer term and to really make a dent in the opioid overdose crisis that we need to. So we shifted gears a bit. Like, we know we can get people to adhere to their antiretrovirals, which is very difficult for some. Maybe we can use this same approach to help people engage in and adhere to medications for opioid addiction. So that's what we're really focused on now. And a new target of this, what we call the I'm Free intervention, that stands for Interactive Messaging for Freedom from Opioid Use Disorders, is stigma, as I had mentioned earlier in my presentation. So I just want to show you a little bit. So what we did was we took it out of the text message, the simple text messaging modality, and we transported it to an app format. And these are a list of the features. This is what it looks like. People choose images. They can choose personalized images, or they can choose images that fall into a theme like animals or nature or fireworks. And in the first 30 days, we send a lot of motivational and psychoeducation messages about buprenorphine, because these are all individuals who are entering treatment for buprenorphine. We have messages addressing the stigma around buprenorphine, because we think these are some of the initial thematic issues that keep people that increase the risk that they're going to drop out. Just like our example earlier of the couple, David and Lila, where Lila had stigmatizing views around medication for opioid use disorders. There's bidirectional messaging. A lot of it is similar to what we did with text messaging, but it has a few more, contemporary features. People can like or dislike the messages. They can favorite a message, and they can go back and look at their favorites. And then we have some motivational messages that mark and reinforce benchmarks, like once they've been in treatment for 30 days, they get like a banner that congratulates them and things like that. And then we do the same message tailoring informed by that face-to-face CBT session with the clinician at the beginning. I just wanted to show you some examples of the messages. AB, this is my project director, Ann Bellows, but it would say her name and say, Ann, take some time today to reflect on something you're proud of achieving this past year, a little bit of education around naloxone and where you can get it free of charge, and some of these kinds of research-based facts around how remaining in MOUD care or medication for opioid use disorder care for a year or longer will help sustain outcomes and motivating them at the same time. Then we also ask them some true or false questions to keep them kind of engaged. Overdoses on Suboxone are rare, and they answer it, and then we tell them, yes, that's true. And then we've really incorporated that research-based information that they were so hungry for. And now I just want to spend the last few minutes here talking about how we address stigma, and then I'll open up for questions. We know that stigma is one of the largest contributing factors to low utilization and treatment retention associated with medication treatment. And you've probably heard of these different dimensions of stigma that have been studied in the HIV literature more extensively. Internalized stigma, or a person's acceptance of a stigmatized identity as really being valid, and microaggressions or subtle discrimination that they experience. And we know that has been very impactful on health behaviors among other chronically ill, highly stigmatized patient populations, such as those with infectious diseases. So we conducted what we think is the first study of stigma experiences related to the use of medication-assisted treatment or medication for opioid use disorders and mental illness in treatment-seeking adults with opioid addiction who were initiating buprenorphine. So we had 28 people complete internalized stigma and microaggressions questionnaires. And we had them complete them separately in relation to opioid addiction and mental health. And we also conducted a qualitative interview to understand better their experiences of stigma surrounding their opioid use disorder and their choice to take medication as their treatment or as a central component of their treatment, as well as their mental health. And what we found was that in both the microaggression and internalized stigma dimensions, on average, when they endorsed on a Likert scale, like how stigmatized they felt in response to various items around the experience of these forms of stigma, that they were feeling more stigmatized around their opioid addiction than they were around their mental health. And just to give you like a little like flavor for the types of things that they were types of items that they were endorsing around their experience of stigma, the most frequently endorsed internalized stigma items where I feel guilty because of my substance use and I feel ashamed by my substance use. The most frequently endorsed microaggression items were when hearing people talk about being clean, like as though they're dirty if they're not sober, seeing people who use substances portrayed negatively in the media, and overall their total scores in the internalized and the microaggressions dimensions were higher for their opioid addiction relative to their mental health. And then getting a little more into how do they experience stigma around taking medication for their opioid addiction, that emerged more directly in our qualitative interviews with them. So when we asked what we thought other people thought about Suboxone, one person said pretty much it's for addicts and maybe they're too mentally weak to do it on their own. Just mainly it's a negative stigma. Why haven't you told your sponsor you're on Suboxone? He doesn't want me to take that stuff at all. I mean, it's pharmaceutical heroin, that's all it is. The other theme that emerged in our interviews around their experience of stigma, and this was coming from the perspective of people who were already in recovery at various stages, was the importance of staying true to one's journey to recovery. So when we asked them, how do you feel about people knowing you're taking Suboxone? Many of them spoke to this same theme. And here's just one example. There's that feeling of stigma attached to Suboxone because the medication prescribed for an opioid addiction, people are going to judge you, but you've got to be focused on your own recovery and what works for you. So we've incorporated this messaging into our app intervention where we say, hey, like, here's what other people who are in recovery from addiction are saying. And we'll quote some of those individuals and what their insights are about how not to let that kind of sense of stigma overwhelm you. We've done a usability test of the intervention, and we're getting the same feedback. The factual science-based information about Suboxone is useful. Great desire for research-based recovery strategies and facts. Some of the challenges we're experiencing are the same as what I see in private industry. Like, app development is kind of slow. It takes longer than you think to debug. Balancing the appeal of new app features. You could think of 50 new app features and a few new ones pop into my head each day, but then you'll never finish developing your intervention. So you can constantly refine it, but you don't really want to drag out the implementation of it over wanting to add more sparkly features. Some of the things that made us the most successful was that we were flexible with our data collection procedures. We piloted different ways. We also tried to anticipate potential sources of frustration and mitigate them, like if the app download process was too difficult, figuring out some ways around that. And then I just want to close with, I pointed out a lot of challenges in our field to achieving recovery successfully for the people who need it. But I wouldn't be in this if I didn't think that there is hope for a better future. And just closing out with one of our motivational banners that we share with our participants, that you have the power to change your story and never give up. And with that, I will stop and take any questions.
Wow. Thank you, Suzette. That was tremendous. Very excited to open up the floor to questions. Ashley, I'm not sure if people can just unmute or if they can raise their hand. Also, feel free to type in the sign in the chat for your questions. And to start off, I'll ask one and then I'll back out. What advice would you give us as opioid researchers in using IT-intensive, technology-intensive modalities and treatments? What makes it, what's a key thing for it to be a successful project if you're going to go down that route?
That's a great question. I think it's the human component, to be honest, which sounds kind of not anti-technology, but but I think something that is overly guided by the technology itself can easily lose people, and they need to feel like somebody is sort of holding their hand through the experience. And some of the feedback we got even from the tech CBT intervention was like, there were some aspects of the intervention, like the personalization of it, the tailoring, that made me feel like someone was talking to me and somebody really cared about me, even though I knew it was not a human. So like, you can definitely approximate that through some of the personalized messaging. And I do think that the personalized features are really important. But then also having someone, and this bears out with the research on technology-assisted treatments as well, is that some involvement of a clinician is quite vital, even if it's very brief. So in some of the studies we've done on computerized CBT and MET for people with cannabis use and depression, we have a clinician at the end of each computerized session talk with the person for 10 minutes, no longer. So it doesn't really it's not very resource intensive, but having that connection with the counselor to really kind of connect the content of the intervention to their daily life, and also just to feel like someone's there for them is really important.
Miriam asks, how available or soon can this be implemented in current telehealth practices?
Sorry, could you repeat it? How available is which? This intervention?
Yes, how available or soon can this be implemented in current telehealth practices?
Well, there are some virtual care platforms that, well, I would say they're usually doing one or the other. Most of them are either like providing pharmacotherapy via telehealth, or they're doing like virtual psychotherapy. There's not all that much in terms of like digital CBT for addiction. But there is the CBT for CBT intervention that Kathy Carroll developed that is available. And we're really hoping that through this randomized trial, like really we want to move towards like implementing and scaling this I'm Free intervention to make it available to really anybody who is initiating MOUD care. So we just kind of like need to validate it first, but that's sort of like part 2 of my mission is to make this type of approach very widely available. And I should say, if anyone knows people who'd be interested in our trial, we are looking for more community partners to help us enroll people into the trial. So if you have any patients yourself who are in buprenorphine care early in the process, as they have to be initiating care, or if you have ties with clinics that treat using buprenorphine, we are really looking to aggressively recruit into our 200 person clinical trial at the moment. So that's another way.
Suzette, let me ask you, as our opioid research center, as we focus on our assessment batteries and our intervention development projects, we have basic science as well as intervention development. What are the key factors, or just any, that really distinguish opioid users from the historical traditional substance use research prior to this latest opioid crisis? My guess is that some of the treatments in terms of structure might be similar, but are there any really unique features that, from your experience, that we should pay attention to?
Like features that you should pay attention to developing as part of your intervention, or like features of the population that you think it's good to know about?
Population and understanding opioids' impact on families and parenting.
Yeah. I think a couple of things that I have noticed in practice and in research is that, first of all, there's a lot of polysubstance use in this population. So sort of like trying to figure out what is the central problem they're struggling with, and has opioid use sort of like risen to the top as sort of their like primary problem, that they're sort of chasing that withdrawal and that's what's really disrupting their life, or are they using opioids maybe a little bit less and more of other things, like sort of like trying to understand the full picture of substance use. That's I think a unique challenge, because it feels a little bit like a moving target sometimes. I think engaging the family as early as possible in the process and trying to help the person through this fear of opening up or coming clean or telling them what you've been doing, because the family often knows a lot more than the patient thinks they do, but yet there's a lot of secrecy involved, I think, and probably there may be a little bit more secrecy. The whole methods needed to, the creativity needed to continue their supply of opioids, can involve a lot of lying and deception. And it's more of an indicator of how severe the addiction is than anything else. But people tend to worry that they're going to alienate family members. They've already usually alienated to some extent. So I think that, like in the case of David and Lila, if we had gotten Lila in the room right away, like really early on, maybe we would have had a better chance with him, and So I think this is very much a family problem, and any addiction is. But I think that trying to get the family on board and trying to do the formative work with the patient around the importance of including their family in their recovery so that everyone can, be successful in their relationships with one another and the way that they handle substance use and slips and relapses. Like, I think it's like really essential with this population to get some family member on board, not just for accountability, but to get the kind of support in place that a person with this kind of very complex and serious illness that often has multiple facets with other substance use and other chronic co-occurring physical health conditions, like they need more than just themselves turning up at treatment. Like there has to be a partner involved.
I see we're at the top of the hour. I really appreciate, I'm kind of an old dog, not in addictions research, but dabbled in it for over the past 30 years. And it's really heartening to hear the message about stigma and family support and social supports are very important in someone's recovery process. It was important some time ago, and then it kind of faded from what I noticed. So it's nice to hear that message again. That's an important part of a holistic research approach. Thank you, everyone, for your time. We were very excited to have Dr. Glasner. We can take one more question as we leave for those that want to stay on. Please type it in the chat if you have one. Do you want to say, how about this? Do you want to leave us with any wisdom about your experience of working in private industry as well as academia, and how important that is to think about the postdocs that we have on board right now and early career scientists?
Yeah, I could say a lot about that. I think actually academia prepares you for industry if you have the kind of like personality that doesn't mind like the fast pace and the pressure of like, especially, in a startup environment, there's a certain pace to it that's different from academia. Like in academia, we have like endless patience for regulatory barriers and, grant submissions and resubmissions, and decisions definitely need to be made a lot more quickly in industry. But I think I came into industry after 14 years in an academic full-time role, and I feel I was really prepared for it because writing grant after grant, you're really essentially writing a business plan. You kind of know more about business running a lab than you really realize. And I think that in academia, we're not even really, and maybe it's changed now, the training, but I don't feel I was really prepared for managing a team when I came into academia. I just knew how to do science and how to design experiments and write really well, but through that experience, being part of a team and leading a team. So I think as many leadership experiences as you can take on as a postdoc, learning to manage people becomes almost as important as knowing how to do science, because you suddenly, you have to sort of like take the village that you have, maximize the output from it, and then do really great science all at the same time. So I think if you're a person who feels like you're inclined towards a faster pace, like industry could be a really interesting experience. But I do think that academically, you want to feel kind of like prepared and sort of like have a really solid understanding of the science of addiction before you take that into industry. Because in the rush, you can sometimes have to make difficult decisions that involve some trade-offs to the kind of like integrity that you're trained with. But the more skillful you are, the better you understand your science and your approach to solving problems, the less trade-off you really have to make, if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. Several things resonated is what you were saying. Oh, I wish we had 2 hours.
Yeah, yeah, really. That's a whole other topic, but I'm very approachable if anyone wants to know more about that.
Yeah, I think we should circulate for those who haven't seen them, some of your recent papers. And I'd love to contact you about some of your measures. That would be really helpful too.
Yeah, happy to
Ashley,
talk about
I'll let you close this out. Outstanding presentation. Thank you, Dr. Glasner.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, everybody. If you did select a CEU, you will receive that by next week. And then the webinar will be available on the website, the recording within the next week as well. So thank you, everybody, for attending today. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much.